Hello, and welcome to the Ozarks Folk Chronicles. Well, the deep freeze of February is thawing now, but today's story is likely to give you another chill. We have always promised to give you the whole story of the hills, the profane, the profound, the preposterous, and the impressive, and today's story falls in the profane category, but not because of language, but because this 1951 murder is cold-blooded to the bone.
That's right, Curtis. And to help us sort out this crazy story, and really, Curtis, I don't know if you know this, but this is like almost the 74th anniversary of this murder, which is a strange anniversary to mark. It would have been like 3 days ago or something.
Wow, yeah.
I know. So this is timely, right?
The timing is good.
The timing is good. And the timing is also good because we have our own Ozark true crime historians, Tammy, Morton, and Angel Wolf back with us. How are y'all doing today, Tammy and Angel?
We're fine, thank you.
Great. We're glad you're here.
So Tammy and Angel, as we all know, the mortgage cow murder is a complicated story, as well as the name. Yeah. But we know you'll be telling the story kind of in broad strokes. What's tremendously helpful is that we have a written record of the murder and the trial by the prosecutor of the case, Doug Mahnkey. We've talked about Doug's mother, Mary Elizabeth, a couple of times on the podcast. But why don't you begin with your telling us about Doug and specifically this document, which I find is fascinating that we have this available to us.
What I find interesting about this document that Doug left is that it was to be sealed until after his death. Because of all the family members involved in this, Doug was very conscientious about not offending anybody or telling names. Even newspaper articles that have been written later changed the names in some of the stories to protect family members. And I think that's important with what we're doing here today. We want to carry on with that and protect family names, but still tell the story as it really happened with the facts.
Right. I mean, there's nobody trying to be vindictive. No. I mean, this is just a part of our story, our culture. I mean, these things happen and they live on. And people are interested, and rightfully so. Angel, would you have anything else to add about Doug Mahnkey? He was your uncle, right?
Yes, he was, a great uncle. He was the brother of my great-grandma. So, but he was a local historian. He was a prosecuting attorney. He was a regular attorney. He was a member of the state House of Representatives. There's a long history with him, and he has a couple of books that he's written about local folklore and history. He's an interesting guy. And
highly respected.
Yes.
Yeah, and he also tried a lot of the most interesting cases ever in Taney County.
Yes. And this is one of them.
Yes.
Right. Well, maybe then the next step is to tell us where and when this whole tragedy occurred. Kind of put us in location and time, please.
Okay, this was in 1951, February of 1951, and this happened around Cedar Creek, Missouri, which is in Taney County.
Okay, not too far when Dee Dee Sanders was on, and she was talking about that crazy case where the fellow murdered his wife and buried her in the gravel. It's somewhat close.
Yes, not too far from where Robert Adams buried his wife on the banks of Beaver Creek.
Right. Cedar Creek kind of flows into Beaver Creek down there, right? Yeah. Okay, Tammy, it's time to meet the cast of characters and begin to flesh out the backstory. Maybe the best way to begin is by telling us about Mr. John May, one of the innocent victims in this story.
Well, John May had a farm down around the Cedar Creek area, and when the dam was being built to form Bull Shoals Lake, the Corps of Engineers was buying up property that could possibly be under the floodwaters, and his property was part of that. The Clarks that lived near him were going to help him out to get as much money from the government as he could get.
Oh, okay. So they were gonna help him out to get payment because he had a fine bottomland farm.
Yes, he
and
did.
in the Ozarks, the best farms are in the bottoms.
Absolutely.
So the Rocky Ridges. But so you mentioned the Clarks.
Mm-hmm.
So how do Arthur and Orma Clark figure in the story?
Well, they befriended Mr. May, and unfortunately, he, for lack of a better term, was probably a little slow. He was easily taken advantage of, and they convinced him if he signed over a deed for all of his property to Orma Clark, that she would be able to get the money from the government faster than he could. He trusted them and believed them, and he signed over the deed. They went to Forsyth with an attorney and signed the deed and had the paperwork filed in the court.
And so he was also elderly, right?
Yes.
So it could have been
Yes.
maybe some dementia.
It could be. Yeah.
Well, do you recall how Doug Mahnkey found out about Clark's scheme to do this?
Well, John May's brother, George May, that lived over around Branson, ran into Doug and said, "Hey, Doug, I think them Clarks are trying to take my brother's land." And Doug went and checked the land records, and yep, that's exactly what was going on.
Sure enough, there was already a deed recorded.
There was.
Oh, my.
And so, Tammy, just to go back to your point, because I find it really interesting, it clarifies something that was in the transcript of that recording. So I remember reading that about that John May, they told him they were going to try to help him get his money. Mm-hmm. But it makes sense now that you're talking about the lake going in. Mm-hmm. So they got the deed signed over to them.
Yes.
So that when it goes underwater, when the lake comes in, then they will get the money. And, of course, John May will get none of it.
None of it, because he's already signed the deed over to them.
Right. Okay, good. That's really helpful. Now, there's another fellow, and this is the real victim, and that's Charlie Cobb.
Correct.
How did the Cobbs get involved in all of this?
Well, they were all neighbors. So the Clarks and the Cobbs and the Mays all lived very close to each other around Cedar Creek. And Charlie Cobb's wife, Ruby, and Arthur Clark's wife, Orma, were very good friends.
Very good friends.
Very good friends.
Well, and the story gets even darker, right? Because
yes.
it's not only about the Clarks taking advantage of this fellow who you described as slow, which I think is right, because somebody who testified said, "I've always treated him," I think they said, as if he were a child.
And that was Charlie Cobb's testimony when they contested the deed. He was going in as a witness, and when he said that he had always treated John May with any dealings like he was a child, that made the judge realize that John May was incompetent to have turned over to sign that deed, and they declared it invalid.
I just wanted to point out that in that transcript, they make mention of the fact that they didn't do this signing over like in the courthouse, or
No.
they went to a hotel room and the paperwork was done.
With a lawyer from another county.
From another county, yes.
Yes.
Oh,
Right.
so it all looked pretty fishy.
Yes.
Because most of the time you go to the title office
Yes.
or the courthouse.
Yes.
And I think that Doug mentioned in that paperwork, Forsyth had plenty of good attorneys. Why
Yes.
would they go all the way
Yes.
over to Gainesville,
Gainesville.
to get an attorney?
Yep.
And so the trial in which Charlie Cobb testified was one that was instigated by John May's brother, so that he would be declared incompetent, and then the deed wouldn't transfer from John May to the Clarks.
Basically, that is exactly correct.
Is that right? Okay. But part of the darkness of this also has to do with Charlie Cobb's wife.
Yes. Charlie's wife, Ruby, was much younger than he was. They had been married for quite some time, had 4 children, but according to the court transcripts from the trials, there was some infidelities in the marriage with Ruby and some other men in the area.
So are you going to be more specific?
That's what I was wondering.
Because I mean, it's kind of important because it's another tie-in between Ruby and Orma.
So, according to the documents, Ruby and Orma were both involved with two brothers from Forsyth, Carl and Clarence Wood. And this involvement is how Ruby mortgaged the cows to have Charlie killed.
Okay.
So Charlie Cobb, I mean, this is what we're building up to, is the murder of Charlie Cobb.
Yes.
And his wife, Ruby, was involved in this murder.
Yes, in the conspiracy to have him killed.
So, just for the sake of our audience and my own sake too, so there's a couple of motives poor Charlie has against him.
Yes, absolutely.
One of them, y'all had mentioned earlier that he had testified in the defense of Mr. May that he was of not mental capacity to deed his farm over. But also we have this extramarital affair issue as well. So he's got a couple things against him, right?
Absolutely. Ruby is finding an opportunity to get rid of her husband because she thinks that Carl Wood will marry her. And she wanted out of her marriage with Charlie Cobb. And the Clarks were upset with Charlie because of the deed and what Charlie had testified with. So they lost this money, and Ruby wants Charlie gone as well.
And you'd already said that Ruby and Orma, of course, they're having extramarital affairs with brothers.
Yes.
But that they were friends anyhow.
Yes.
So there was this connection with the Clarks. So, and I think that's what makes the story so interesting and so complicated at the same time.
Yes.
Yeah, so I think now we need to hear about the details of the murder. What happened on that fateful day?
Well, about 4 o'clock in the afternoon on February 20th, 1951, Charlie Cobb went to his barn to milk his cow like he did every day about that time. And when he didn't come back to the house, Ruby sent the two oldest boys to go find their dad. And when they went to the barn, they found that he had been murdered. I remember the stories from when I was little. Everyone thought that it was pitchfork, that they had killed him with a pitchfork. But I think in the trial they found that that wasn't the case, but it was a heavy piece of metal. And it was obviously someone he knew because he did not put up a struggle. But his two boys, I think they were 7 and 8, are the ones that found their dad, which is heartbreaking.
That is heartbreaking. And, after, reading Doug Mahnkey's unsealed papers, those documents, they did kind of detail, and it was graphic. And,
Yes.
He was bludgeoned in the skull, and that is just awful.
Yes.
An awful double tragedy. First he died, and then his children find him.
Yes.
Terrible.
And the question that comes up, and maybe Tammy, you can shed some light on this, is did Ruby know that he had been killed?
From the court transcripts, she conspired to have him killed, and she knew and sent the boys down to find their dad.
That's cold-blooded.
That is cold-blooded.
Well, and there was even a, it's very detailed that there was a plot to, at one point, to inject air into his veins.
Yes.
With a bicycle pump, I believe is what it was.
That's right, with a tire pump.
Yes, a tire pump.
And then they were going to throw him off a bluff.
Yes.
And it was one of the Wood brothers that said, "Oh, you can't do that because the buzzards will give you away." Yes.
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
so you have this huge conspiracy because you have the Clarks, you have Ruby, and you have the Woods brothers that are all conspiring against Charlie Cobb, or so it seems at this point. And then that's when the trials get very complicated because so many people are involved.
Right. And, not to make any kind of inferences or anything, but there's obviously some kind of planning involved because that when they were going to take the bicycle pump and inject air into the veins, they got that from a recent real life murder that had occurred and they'd heard about in the news. So they're thinking, how are we going to get rid of this guy? And then obviously, what was it, Clarence Wood that said you can't throw them over the bluff after that because the buzzards will give it away.
Yes.
When the buzzards start circling,
Yep.
That's when they know where to look for the body.
You know what's curious, and I'm sure you can shed some light on this, both of y'all, is what would have been Arthur Clarke's motive? I mean, we understand Ruby. She wants to get rid of, really to discard an older husband so that she can have this affair, which we really don't know if Carl would have married her or not. That might have been her own fantasy. Who knows?
I think he was already married.
Oh, he was married.
Yeah.
Wow. So what was Arthur Clarke's motive?
Well, keep in mind that the first trial was about John May's competence to have made this deed, turning his land over to Orma Clarke. So it was determined that he was incompetent. Then there's another trial to actually have the deed completely overturned, and they were going to need Charlie Cobb's testimony in that. So Arthur and Orma Clarke did not want Charlie testifying about the deed to have the deed completely overturned. If Charlie's gone, he doesn't testify. Ruby has a way of getting rid of her husband she doesn't want, so it's a perfect storm of bringing people together, with Charlie Cobb being the victim of both.
Okay, so we've established that Charlie was murdered. We know that part of the story. We know the players in the story. So how did it come about that all the suspicion fell on Arthur Clarke?
Well, when Sheriff George Hunt questioned Ruby, under close questioning, she told everything. She just, as Doug Mahnkey said, she just spilled the beans.
Well, I hate to say it, but she doesn't sound like a very good criminal if she's involved potentially in a murder and didn't even make it to trial. She's already spilling the beans. What happened?
Well, keep in mind that you have Sheriff George Hunt and a highway patrolman. They have Ruby in a room questioning her very closely. I'm sure, my opinion, that she was scared and just told everything that she knew. So then Sheriff Hunt goes to the Clark's house to question them, and the Clark's 9-year-old daughter Frida says, "Oh yeah, I've heard my mom and dad talk about killing Charlie Cobb."
Oh my goodness.
Wow. Well, then Tammy, what happened next?
Well, a few days later, Sheriff George Hunt went to the Clark's home, but Arthur and Orma were not at home, but his dad was there. And his dad gave Sheriff Hunt permission to come in and search the house. Sheriff Hunt did not have a warrant, and Arthur's dad was not a resident, so he did not have legal permission or legal standing to give permission. In the search of the house, Sheriff Hunt found a note that had been stuffed in around a window, and it was where Ruby Cobb had said, "I will mortgage our 2 best cows to you if you will kill Charlie." And it was signed.
Oh, so that's how we get the mortgage cow murder.
Gotcha. Okay.
So you're saying, I'm sorry, just to kind of replow this ground. So it's not only that Clarke wants to get rid of Cobb because he doesn't want him to testify again, because they're still hoping to get that farm, to get that money.
Right.
And it's not just that Ruby wants to offer a husband because she wants to continue this relationship, but she also thought, well, I'll throw a couple cows in the deal. and that's going to tip the scales, right? That's what was the motive.
Well, if they get that brand new farm of perfect bottomland, why not have 2 great cows to start their operation?
Oh,
with?
they sold the cows. They took them to the stockyards and sold them, because later on it's testified that people saw Arthur Clarke bring the cows and sell them.
So she
He got the cows.
He got the cows.
She upheld her into the mortgage.
She did. She
Lousy criminal, but a good businesswoman.
I suppose so. So I'm going to jump ahead a little bit, and this is based off of Doug's papers that were unsealed. But we do know that we have all these players in this event, and Doug had mentioned that they tried it as a conspiracy. But so we find out from Doug's papers that during the trial that the defense tried to throw up a smokescreen. What does that mean?
Well, in this case, it had to do with the Wood brothers. Carl was a good suspect and to point blame to because he had already killed 2 other men before. And so it's not like anybody would say, oh, he would never do anything like that. He was a good scapegoat, if nothing else, and he was having an affair with Ruby.
And he wasn't named as part of this conspiracy.
No.
It was the Clarks and Ruby and yeah.
But the defense really didn't have a whole lot of other things because Frida Clark had testified against her parents. They had the mortgage paper for the 2 cows. They had Ruby's testimony. So all they could do was try to deflect and say, oh, but these other people were involved as well.
So just for clarification, and please tell me if I've misunderstood it. So if they can sort of spread the blame around in terms of a conspiracy. Mm-hmm. So everybody that's part of the conspiracy has to take the fall for it. It's what one does, yes. Everyone's guilty of. Yes. However, the sentencing would be lighter. Is that what I'm to understand? Would that be part of the value of deflecting everything toward Carl Wood?
I believe so, because initially for this crime, it would have been the death penalty, which would have been the electric chair at that time. And if they could muddy the waters somewhat, they were trying to take that death penalty off the table and just get the prison sentence.
A life sentence instead,
yes.
Yeah. And it also sounds like at some time in the future we need to come back and visit Carl Wood and his activities.
Oh, yeah. There's a good story about Carl and down in Pro Tem, and we got to talk about that later.
That sounds like another interesting story. That's great. Yes. Thank you. Okay, so Tammy, Doug says, though, in spite of all this evidence, that the case was eventually thrown out because of a technicality? What's up with that?
Well, remember when I told you that Sheriff Hunt went to Arthur Clark's house and Arthur's father gave permission to search the house? He did not have the right to do that, and Sheriff Hunt did not have a warrant. So that paper that Ruby had signed mortgaging the cows was thrown out, and that was a big part of the evidence that had tied them together. So again, you're trying to deflect a little bit, so as the defense attorney, so your clients don't get the death penalty at this point.
So you're just trying to get the best sentence that
yes.
you can.
Yes.
Right, well, that makes sense. So were Ruby, Orma, and Arthur convicted?
Ruby and Orma were convicted of conspiracy to commit murder.
Yeah, and I noticed on the State versus Clark case, the actual court documents, that damning piece of evidence was the mortgage for those cows. That's where we get the name of the case here, right? And this is really interesting. This is the actual wording of that note. Quote unquote, February 7th, 1951. To Orma Clark at Kazee Mills, Missouri, quote unquote, I will give you my 2 good cows if I don't get you your money in 4 days after it is done. Your friend, Ruby Cobb. Keep this. So that's the actual note.
And that was written not to Arthur, but to his wife, Orma.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
So that's pretty ambiguous, though, isn't it? I mean,
it's like
when
it's showing
done.
It's showing that these 2 women, they're obviously very close, good friends,
best friends.
I think they were the ones that were orchestrating this all along. And Arthur, well, which we find out because he was eventually convicted as well.
Of first-degree murder.
According to the documents, first-degree murder. And also in those state documents is a kind of a damning description for him as well. A physician in Taney County, this is from the court documents, expressed the opinion that the weapon used was, quote unquote, a pretty heavy club with nails in it. So it's just brutal.
That is brutal.
Yeah.
So he finally was convicted, Arthur Clark, first degree murder, using this horrible. And Angel, I think you said something about that. He was a blacksmith, or he could have made this sort of weapon easily enough.
It was speculated that he could have possibly, created a weapon.
Wow. Well, so Tammy, part of what I think confuses me about this is Doug will go on to say in the transcript of that recording that Arthur Clark eventually comes back to his office, and he's frightened, right, because of his role as a prosecutor in this. He talks about another fellow that's in the office that goes out the back door when he sees Arthur Clark coming.
Yep.
But how in the world, having been convicted of first-degree murder with the kind of weapon that Curtis just described, was Arthur Clark able to come back to Doug Mahnkey and, submit divorce papers, or whatever it is that he was trying to get, a divorce?
Well, Hayden, he served his 9 years for first-degree murder and then was released. And he went to Illinois for a while, but he came back to Taneyville because that's where his family was at.
And that's just the way it was.
Yes.
As unfair as it might seem to us about poor Charlie Cobb, what a god-awful way to be dispatched in the end. And yet Arthur's there to get a divorce from whom?
From Orma, I believe, because Arthur ends up remarrying another lady. I remember when Arthur got out of prison, he came to our house to visit. My mom and dad knew him well.
Well, what do you make of the fact that he came back to Doug Mahnkey's office, the prosecutor of his case? Why would he do that?
I think the answer to that's very simple. Doug Mahnkey was that well respected by everyone in the community. And in this case, even someone that he had convicted of first-degree murder still respected Doug. And that says a lot about the character of Doug Mahnkey.
It must be something to that effect. It's such an unusual turn in the case.
So, it sounds like from what we've discussed today that the Wood brothers, they were at least a cause for some of this, the reason for this murder, but also may have been part of the conspiracy, with talk about, you can't do this a certain way because the buzzards will give away and so forth. Were they ever convicted or penalized for any role in this at all?
No, they were not. But that's a story for another day.
Okay. Oh, that sounds good.
I like that.
I like that too. Yeah, Curtis, it was an excellent point. Given Angel's comment earlier about the tire pump and the buzzards, it seems like they would have gotten convicted. But I'm glad that you all raised that.
I think that was all hearsay.
Right.
Yeah.
So Doug Mahnkey recorded this whole tangled tale on a tape recorder, and in a later recording, he said that he, Doug, and a deputy sheriff performed what he admitted was an illegal search of Arthur Clark's home to confirm a description that little Frida Clark had given of her father's clothes. Tammy, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, they found the clothes that young Miss Frida had talked about, and on the jacket there was a dark stain that was determined to be human blood. But keep in mind, there was no DNA evidence at that time. They don't know whose blood it was. They just knew it was human, but it was enough for Doug to truly believe that Arthur Clark did commit this crime. And so I think Doug felt confident moving on with the prosecution because I knew Doug, and Doug was a very honorable man, and I don't think he would have ever prosecuted someone for the crime of murder unless he was 100% sure that he had done it. And I think this helped convince Doug that he was on the right track.
Yeah, that sounds right. And it goes back to something, Angel, that we were talking about when we weren't recording. That, I mean, it's just purely circumstantial at that point.
Right. Yes.
And like Tammy, like you said, it could have been his own.
Right.
Well, I do have another question for you, though, because we need to circle back to the origin of the whole controversy, which was John May and this deed that he had signed over to the Clarks and this whole trial of competency. Whatever happened with that?
I believe that John's daughter came in and stepped in, and the government did pay for that land that's now under the lake.
But she got it. I mean, it went to the...
I believe the...
Was he still alive? Was John May still alive? Do you know when that went in? Did he ever get to enjoy, the sale of his own property? Do you know?
I'm not sure, because he was an elderly man at that time, and so I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's interesting. But
Now I've got to go research Hayden.
there's always another question, isn't there?
I'm going to go down another rabbit hole with this one.
but it's so much fun.
Oh, it is.
I know. It's nice though to see that justice was done, at least because we all feel not only for Mr. May, but of course for Charlie Cobb, whose only offense was having a young wife and telling the truth, as far as I can see from the way this whole story unfolded. Well, this is on target, but not quite. It was part of the transcript, and this is something that Doug had in his recording. He talks about how in one of the recordings, it was actually done on August the 8th, 1987. His son, Pat, came to him and related this story. He said to his father that he had picked up Carl Wood to give him a ride, and that when Carl got out of the car, he said to Pat, "Be a good boy, love God, and don't kill anybody unless you have to." And
Good advice.
it is good advice. But Tammy, you talked about setting us up for another story to come. And I think that Carl's final words to Pat might also cue up a future story. Is that right?
Absolutely, because Carl was involved with 2 other murders that were self-defense.
Yeah, and that Doug defended, right?
Doug
Yes.
defended.
That's right. And Curtis, you had mentioned something about it was at Pro Tem. Is that right?
Yeah, that's something for another day.
Nothing for another day. Well, I'm just trying to tease the audience.
It's a good one.
You mean a killing in a church in front of a bunch of people in pro tem?
Exactly. That's right. Well, Tammy, Angel, do you all have anything else to add to this wild story?
There is a kind of a funny anecdote, I guess, if you want to call it that. Doug mentions that while all this was going on, or maybe right after, that he was driving down the road with a few people, and they noticed the car was wobbling really bad. And so finally he stopped, he got out and looked, and somebody had undone the lug nuts on the back tires. So there was always speculation as to, well, who could have done that?
Yeah, no, that's good. That's a good part of the story.
And Hayden, something that my mama heart always goes out to is the children. You've got the Cobb boys that found their father's body. You've got little Frida Clark, who as a 9-year-old had to testify against her own parents. She was put in foster care. So the lives of those kids were turned completely upside down by this. And to me, that is heartbreaking.
Absolutely right. That's good.
Yeah. It's kind of a part of our Ozarks culture that we're not always proud of, is that there was some violence, and there's some stories we find intriguing now, but I think it's important that we never forget that these are human stories, human interest stories. And although they're intriguing because they involve these difficult topics, that we always need to realize that it affects people. And so, yeah, Tammy, I totally understand where you're coming from.
Well, Tammy, Angel, thank y'all so much for being with us and telling us another story of these wild and woolly Ozarks. Some crazy stuff has happened in these hills. Yeah,
thank you, Tammy and Angel, both for coming here and sharing your knowledge with us. You know, every once in a while it's great to hear these old true crime stories. I know our audience enjoys it, and we couldn't do it without you and your years of research. And thanks to our listeners for tuning in. If you're enjoying the Ozarkian Folk Chronicles, we hope you'll follow us on your favorite streaming service, give us a nice review, and perhaps most important, share the Chronicles with your friends. They might also enjoy an Ozarkian celebration of the profane, the profound, the preposterous, and the impressive. We'll see you next time.
Have a great day.